August 13th, 1521. A city that once held 250,000 souls falls silent. Smoke drifts across a lake that has turned to rubble. Somewhere on the water, a single brigantine overtakes a fleeing canoe, and a young man of perhaps 25 years rises to his feet and surrenders. His name is Cuauhtémoc. He is the last independent ruler the Mexico will ever have. And the empire he inherited, an empire of 5 to 6 million people stretching across central Mexico, has just been destroyed by a force that arrived 2 years earlier, numbering roughly 600 men. 600. That number is not legend. It is documented in the letters Hernán Cortés himself sent to the Spanish crown and confirmed by soldiers who were there. How does a force outnumbered by thousands to one not merely survive, but conquer? That is the question this film exists to answer. And the answer is far stranger, far more layered, and far more unsettling than any simple tale of technological superiority. Because Cortés did not conquer the Mexico with steel and gunpowder alone. He conquered them by turning their own world against them. And one critical decision, made months before the final siege, in a landlocked city far from any water, is the reason Cuauhtémoc ended up in that canoe at all. This is the complete reconstruction. Not a summary, not a highlight. The full collision, rebuilt from the ground up. We begin years before any Spaniard set foot on the mainland, inside the island capital of Tenochtitlan at its zenith, a city larger than any in Europe, threaded with canals, fed by engineered aqueducts, connected to the shore by 3 great causeways that are both its lifelines and its defenses. We examine the Mexico war machine, its eagle and jaguar warriors, its obsidian-edged weapons, its doctrine of capture over killing, and we ask what made it devastating and what made it vulnerable. Then we cross the Atlantic to the Spain that forged Cortés, a nation fresh from 8 centuries of holy war, armed with steel, horses, crossbows, and an appetite for empire that had already consumed the Caribbean. We follow the unauthorized expedition from Cuba, the burning of the ships, the bloody battles against Tlaxcalan that somehow became the most consequential alliance in the history of the Americas. We walk beside the column as it crosses the volcanic pass and sees the lake valley for the first time. We enter the capital as guests who are already planning to become conquerors. We witness the months of tension inside the palace, the massacre that shattered the peace, and the catastrophic retreat known as the Noche Triste, when over 800 Spaniards and thousands of allied warriors died on the causeways in a single night. We follow the shattered survivors to the plain of Otumba, where everything nearly ended again. And then we watch the most extraordinary engineering gamble of the 16th century unfold. 13 warships, built in pieces in the mountains of Tlaxcalan, carried overland by 8,000 porters, assembled on the lakeshore, and launched into the waters that had always been the Mexico's greatest defense. The 75-day siege that follows is a war of starvation, engineering, and political fracture, fought on causeways, in canals, and across a lake that slowly becomes a trap for the defenders rather than a shield. We reconstruct it phase by phase, advance and counterattack until the final morning. What makes this story extraordinary is not simply the scale of the upset. It is that the Mexican Empire was not defeated by foreigners alone. It was defeated by a coalition of its own former subjects, tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who chose to fight alongside the strangers because the tributary system that enriched Tenochtitlan had given them reason enough to want it gone. Cortés did not invent that resentment. He weaponized it, and the world that emerged from the ashes, colonial New Spain, was built directly on top of the ruins, literally. Modern Mexico City sits on the bones of Tenochtitlan. The lake is gone, paved over, but the grid of the old causeways still shapes the streets. The story never ended. It just went underground. If you value complete reconstructions of the clashes that reshaped civilizations, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Every time, we take one legendary collision and rebuild it from the first spark to the last consequence, separating what the sources prove from what legend has added, because the documented truth is almost always more gripping than the myth. Let us begin where this story truly begins, not with the strangers on the coast, but with an eagle perched on a cactus in the middle of a lake and the city that rose around it. In the early 14th century, somewhere along the marshy western shore of Lake Texcoco, a people without a homeland search for a sign. The Mexica are latecomers to the Valley of Mexico, a high basin ringed by volcanoes at an altitude of more than 7,000 feet. Dozens of city-states already claim the fertile lakeshore. The Mexica serve as mercenaries, are driven from one settlement to another, and carry with them a prophecy. Their patron deity Huitzilopochtli has promised them a place where an eagle perches on a cactus growing from a stone. According to later Mexica accounts recorded in sources like the Codex Mendoza and the chronicles compiled under Bernardino de Sahagún, they find this sign on a swampy island near the western shore of the lake around the year 1325. The place they name Tenochtitlan. It is, by any strategic measure, an extraordinary choice. The island offers natural defense on every side. No army can approach without crossing open water, yet the site demands engineering on a scale few societies of the era attempt. The Mexica begin building chinampas, rectangular plots of fertile land constructed from layers of lake sediment, vegetation, and wooden stakes driven into the shallow lake bed. Over generations, these floating gardens multiply until they extend the island's usable surface many times over, producing maize, beans, squash, and amaranth in quantities sufficient to feed a growing population. By the early 15th century, Tenochtitlan enters the alliance that will make it an imperial capital. Around 1428, the Mexica join with the city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan to form the Triple Alliance, overthrowing the dominant Tepanec power at Azcapotzalco. Within decades, Tenochtitlan becomes the senior partner. Tribute flows inward from as many as 38 provinces, stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific lowlands, cacao, cotton, jade, quetzal feathers, gold dust, rubber, and thousands of captives. The system is held together not by occupation, but by the threat of punitive war against any province that refuses payment. 3 great causeways connect the island to the mainland, north toward Tepeyac, west toward Tlacopan, and south toward Iztapalapa. Each is broad enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast, though no horse has ever set foot upon them. Removable wooden bridges span gaps in the causeways, allowing canoe traffic to pass and defenders to isolate the city in moments. A double aqueduct from the springs at Chapultepec carries fresh water across the lake, its twin channels allowing one to be cleaned while the other flows. The engineering is deliberate, sophisticated, and old by the time Europeans first hear rumors of a great city in the interior. At the center of the island rises the sacred precinct, a walled compound roughly 400 paces on each side, dominated by the Templo Mayor, a twin staircase pyramid standing perhaps 150 feet high, crowned by shrines to Huitzilopochtli and the rain deity Tlaloc. Around it spread palaces, schools for elite warriors, a ball court, and the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, the sister city on the island's northern end, where on a busy day perhaps 60,000 people trade under the supervision of appointed judges. By the reign of Moctezuma II, who takes power around the year 1502, the city holds between 200,000 and 250,000 inhabitants. It is larger than any city in Spain, larger than Paris or London. The Tlatoani rules from a palace complex with hundreds of rooms, attended by a bureaucracy that manages tribute rolls recorded in painted codices with meticulous precision. Eagle and Jaguar warrior orders form the elite military corps, their ranks earned through battlefield capture. The army can mobilize tens of thousands within days through obligations imposed on each Kalpulli, the neighborhood-based kinship units that organize civil and military life alike. Yet the system carries a structural vulnerability that no amount of engineering can remedy. The empire rules through fear and extraction, not integration. Conquered peoples owe tribute but receive little in return. Tlaxcala, a confederation of 4 polities barely 80 miles to the east, has resisted Mexican domination for generations, enduring economic blockade rather than submission. Other provinces simmer. The Triple Alliance is an engine of wealth and power, but its fuel is resentment, and resentment is a resource that any sufficiently ruthless outsider might learn to harvest. In 1519, the causeways still stand unbroken, the aqueducts still flow, and the markets still hum with commerce from 2 oceans. Somewhere beyond the eastern sea, 11 ships are being loaded. Those 11 ships ride at anchor in the harbor of Santiago de Cuba through the final weeks of 1518, and the man loading them has spent nearly 2 decades preparing for a moment that no one has authorized him to seize. The Spain that produced Hernán Cortés is itself a war machine only recently forged. The fall of Granada in 1492 ended nearly 8 centuries of intermittent warfare against Moorish kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula, and the generation that fought those final campaigns carried specific military habits across the Atlantic. They understood siege warfare, the reduction of fortified cities, the patient grinding of supply lines. They understood diplomacy with fractured enemies, the art of turning one local lord against another. And they understood that a royal commission, however loosely worded, could be stretched to cover almost any ambition if the results produced enough gold for the crown. Spanish arms in this era combine medieval weight with emerging gunpowder technology. The Toledo steel sword, roughly 3 feet of double-edged blade, can shear through wooden shields and quilted armor that will stop obsidian. Crossbows deliver bolts at ranges exceeding 150 paces with penetrating force no cotton padding can absorb. The harquebus, a matchlock firearm weighing perhaps 15 pounds, is slow to reload, unreliable in rain, but its report alone panics men and animals unfamiliar with gunpowder. The warhorse, standing 14 to 15 hands, carrying an armored rider with a steel-tipped lance, functions as a shock weapon without equivalent in the Americas. Mastiff war dogs, trained to attack on command, add another dimension of terror. Yet none of these weapons exist in numbers sufficient to conquer anything alone. Cortés will sail with roughly 600 men, 16 horses, 14 cannon of small caliber, and limited powder. Against an empire of millions, this is not an army. It is a catalyst. Cortés himself is 33 years old, a failed law student from Medellin in Extremadura, a notary's son who arrived in Hispaniola at 19 seeking fortune. He has spent 14 years in the Caribbean, accumulating land, indigenous laborers, minor officers, and a reputation for both charm and ruthlessness. He is literate, legally shrewd, physically tough, and possessed of a gambler's instinct for the irreversible gesture. Governor Diego Velázquez of Cuba commissions him to lead an expedition to the coast already glimpsed by prior voyages under Hernández de Córdoba and Grijalva, but the commission specifies exploration and trade, not conquest or settlement. As Cortés's preparations grow conspicuously ambitious, Velázquez moves to revoke the commission. Cortés, warned in time, accelerates his departure. He sails from Cuba on the 18th of February, 1519, technically a mutineer against his own governor, commanding 11 vessels carrying perhaps 530 soldiers, 100 sailors, several hundred Cuban indigenous auxiliaries, and the 16 horses that will reshape the tactical equation on the mainland. He carries with him something no manifest lists, an understanding, absorbed from Caribbean campaigns and Reconquista tradition, that small forces win not by overwhelming, but by dividing. The tributary resentments of the Mexico world are not yet known to him, but the instinct to find them, to ask the right questions through interpreters not yet acquired, to offer alliance before offering battle, is already the core of his method. The ships clear the Cuban coast and turn west toward a continent whose political fault lines are about to receive the most consequential stress test in their history. While those ships push westward through the Caribbean swells, the war machine they are sailing toward has been perfecting itself for 7 decades. To understand what Cortés will face on the mainland, one must understand how the Mexica make war, not as Europeans imagine warfare, but as a system inseparable from politics, religion, and the tributary economy that holds the Triple Alliance together. Every male child born in Tenochtitlan enters a world organized for combat. By age 15, he trains at the Tlaxcalan, the young men's house attached to his calpule, the neighborhood ward that serves as the basic unit of both civic life and military mobilization. There are roughly 20 calpulli in Tenochtitlan alone, each capable of fielding several hundred warriors on short notice. The sons of nobility attend the Calmecac, where training is more rigorous and the path leads toward the elite orders. A young warrior earns rank not by killing enemies, but by capturing them. One captive elevates him above commoner status. 4 captives in successive campaigns earn the right to wear the distinctive lip plug and feathered regalia that mark a veteran. The eagle warriors and jaguar warriors, the quartly and ocelotl, represent the apex of this meritocratic ladder, men who have seized multiple prisoners in hand-to-hand combat and proven themselves across years of campaigning. The weapon that defines Mexica close combat is the macuahuitl, a flat wooden club, roughly 3.5 feet long, its edges set with razor-sharp obsidian blades. Spanish sources later attest that a single stroke could sever a horse's head. Likely exaggeration, but the cutting power of knapped obsidian exceeds that of surgical steel. At range, warriors employ the atlatl, a spear thrower that extends the arm's leverage to hurl darts with enough force to penetrate Spanish cotton padding at 60 paces. Slings hurl smooth stones with lethal accuracy. Bows, though present, are less central than in many contemporary armies. Defensive equipment centers on the ichcahuipili, a quilted cotton garment soaked in brine and dried stiff, effective enough against obsidian and stone that the Spanish themselves will adopt it in the tropical lowlands. Mobilization follows the tributary hierarchy. When the Tlatoani orders a campaign, messengers carry the summons outward through the provinces. Each altepetal, each city-state within the alliance's reach, owes a quota of warriors proportional to its tribute obligations. Armies of 20,000 are routine. Campaigns against distant provinces like Soconusco or the Mixtec Highlands may field 40,000 or more. Logistics depend on human porters, the Tlamim, each carrying roughly 50 pounds across 20 miles per day. There are no draft animals, no wheeled transport. Every arrow, every shield, every ration of toasted maize and amaranth moves on human backs. This limits campaign range to roughly 2 weeks' march from major supply centers, a constraint that shapes the entire geography of Mexican expansion. Yet the deepest distinction lies in battlefield doctrine. The Flower Wars, the Xochiaoyotl, are not mere ritual exercises but sustained, politically calibrated conflicts designed to provide captives, test warriors, and maintain pressure on unconquered neighbors like Tlaxcala. On the open field, Mexican armies advance behind a screen of missile troops, then close in disciplined squadron blocks identified by towering feathered standards. The objective is not annihilation, but envelopment and individual capture. A warrior who kills an enemy he might have taken alive earns no honor. This doctrine produces superb individual fighters and sophisticated small unit tactics. It does not produce armies trained to destroy an opposing force as a coherent body. Against enemies who share the same conventions, this system has dominated central Mexico for generations. Against an enemy who fights to kill, who deploys massed steel at the point of contact, who uses cavalry to shatter formations from the flank, the system has never been tested. The obsidian edge is sharper than steel, but it shatters on first impact with a metal shield. The Macuahuitl cannot be resharpened in the field. And the doctrine of capture means that at the critical instant of close combat, a Mexican warrior reaches to grapple while his opponent thrusts to finish. Somewhere west of Cuba, on waters the Mexica have never seen, the force that will exploit every one of these vulnerabilities draws closer to the coast. The coast of Tabasco materializes through morning haze in March of 1519, low green jungle pressing against brown river water, and somewhere beyond the tree line, warriors are already gathering. Cortés brings his 11 ships into the mouth of the Grijalva River with roughly 550 soldiers, 100 sailors, and 16 horses still unsteady from weeks at sea. The Tabascans meet the landing parties with force. At the Battle of Kentla, Spanish cavalry charges for the first time on the American mainland. 13 horsemen ride into massed infantry that has never seen a mounted warrior. The shock is absolute. Tabascan formations break not from casualties, but from incomprehension. The horse and rider appear as a single creature, enormous, fast, armored in a substance no obsidian club can shatter. The engagement lasts perhaps an hour. Among the gifts offered in its aftermath come 20 enslaved women, and among them is the one the Spanish will call Marina, Malintzin, a Nahua-speaking woman of noble origin sold into coastal slavery. She speaks both Nahuatl and Chontal Maya. Paired with Geronimo de Aguilar, a shipwrecked Spaniard who speaks Maya, she gives Cortés something no weapon can replace: a voice that reaches directly into the political heart of the Mexico world. By April, the expedition anchors near the sand dunes of what will become Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz. Here the first Mexica envoys arrive, emissaries of Moctezuma carrying gifts of staggering craftsmanship: gold discs the size of wagon wheels, featherwork of Quetzal and Cotinga, jade masks, textiles finer than anything Castile produces. The message is unmistakable. The Tlatoani acknowledges the strangers' power and wishes them to take these treasures and leave. Cortés reads the message exactly backward. Every gold object confirms that the interior holds wealth beyond imagination. Every warning becomes an invitation. He founds Veracruz as a legal municipality, has his men elect him captain and chief justice, a procedural maneuver that transfers his authority from the governor of Cuba, who has already revoked his commission, to the crown itself. It is a lawyer's gamble dressed as a town council, and it works because no one present has the power to challenge it, and because the gold makes everyone complicit. Then comes the decision that defines the entire campaign. Sometime in August, Cortés orders the fleet stripped and scuttled. Later chronicles say he burned the ships. The documented sources indicate he had them beached, their rigging and ironwork salvaged, their hulls bored through and sunk. The distinction matters less than the consequence. 500 men standing on a hostile coast now have no retreat. Every soldier understands the arithmetic. March inland and conquer, or die on this beach. Cortés transforms a divided expedition, riddled with partisans of the Cuban governor, into a force with only one direction. The hardware from those ships will reappear months later as fittings for weapons, tools, and eventually the brigantines that decide the siege. Malintzin, meanwhile, is already translating the whispered grievances of coastal Totonac lords at Chempoala, a city of perhaps 25,000 that pays crushing tribute to Tenochtitlan in textiles, food, and sacrificial captives. The Totonac chief tells Cortés what no Spanish scout could discover alone. The empire is hated. Dozens of subject peoples resent the tribute, fear the flower wars, and remember their own sovereignty. Cortés does not yet have the allied army that will make siege possible, but at Chempoala he finds the fracture line that runs beneath the entire Mexico world. He needs only to widen it. The column forms up in mid-August: Spaniards, Totonac porters, and a handful of Cuban war dogs, and turns its face toward the mountains. Beyond those mountains lies Tlaxcalan, a nation that has fought the Triple Alliance to a standstill for generations and whose answer to the stranger's arrival will determine whether Cortés marches into Tenochtitlan or vanishes into the jungle like every other adventurer the Caribbean has swallowed. The column climbs through September heat into the high valleys east of the Sierra Madre, and the land itself changes. The air thins. Cornfields stretch across plateaus ringed by volcanic ridges, and the settlements here are not Totonac villages paying tribute to a distant capital. This is Tlaxcalan, a confederation of 4 allied lordships governing perhaps 150,000 to 300,000 people, hemmed in on every side by Mexico-aligned territory for decades, denied salt, denied cotton, denied trade, yet never conquered. The Tlaxcalans have fought the Triple Alliance to a grinding stalemate through generations of flower wars, and their warriors are among the finest in the Central Highlands. They have no reason to trust strangers arriving from the coast with Totonac allies in tow. The first contact is not diplomatic. In early September of 1519, Tlaxcalan war parties strike the advancing column in open country near the eastern frontier. The attacks come in waves, thousands of warriors in feathered regalia, wielding macuahuitl and atlatl, pressing against a formation of fewer than 400 Spaniards, supported by perhaps 1,000 Totonac auxiliaries. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, writing decades later, recalls formations so dense they seemed to cover the entire plain. The engagements last several days. Spanish cavalry charges scatter individual contingents but cannot break the overall mass. Crossbow bolts and harquebus fire create momentary gaps that close almost instantly. At night, the column draws into defensive squares, horses stamping in the cold mountain air, sentries watching firelight on the surrounding hills. What saves the Spanish is not steel alone, but division within the Tlaxcalan Council. The war faction, led by the young commander Xicotencatl the Younger, presses for annihilation. But the elder lords, particularly Maxixcatzin, calculate differently. They have watched the strangers fight for days without breaking. They know the Mexica Empire is the true enemy, and they understand something Moctezuma does not yet grasp. These foreigners can be used. By late September, the council overrules Xicotencatl. Envoys arrive at the Spanish camp bearing food, mantles, and an invitation. Cortés enters the city of Tlaxcala itself in the first days of October, and what he finds transforms his entire strategic position. Here is a nation with a standing military tradition, deep institutional hatred of the Mexica, organized logistics capable of feeding armies in the field, and an intimate knowledge of every road, garrison, and political weakness in the Valley of Mexico. The Tlaxcalans do not submit. They negotiate as sovereign allies, and the terms they extract will echo for generations after the conquest, including exemption from tribute and retention of local governance. The alliance is not charity. It is strategic calculation on both sides. Cortés gains the manpower that 600 Spaniards can never provide, thousands of warriors, tens of thousands of porters, intelligence networks reaching into the heart of the empire. Tlaxcala gains something it has sought for decades, a partner capable of tipping the balance against the Triple Alliance. Neither side fully trusts the other. Xicotencatl the Younger remains openly hostile, and Cortés keeps his own counsel about long-term intentions. But the arithmetic is unanswerable. Alone, the Spanish are a raiding party. With Tlaxcala, they become the nucleus of a coalition that can challenge Tenochtitlan itself. Through October, the combined force rests, resupplies, and grows. Tlaxcalan scouts brief the Spanish on the causeways, the lake, the aqueducts, the political fault lines among tributary states already wavering. The road ahead leads through Cholula, a sacred city aligned with the Mexica, and then down into the Valley of Mexico, where Moctezuma waits behind his lake, still sending gifts of gold and polite requests to turn back. Each gift only confirms what the Tlaxcalans already know. The Tlatoani is uncertain, and uncertainty in a tributary empire is a crack that widens under pressure. By late October, the column forms again, Spanish steel at its core, Tlaxcalan thousands on its flanks, and begins the march toward Cholula, toward the volcanoes, toward the lake. Cholula lies in a broad valley at the foot of the sacred pyramid, a city of perhaps 30,000, and the column enters it in late October with Tlaxcalan allies camped outside the walls at Cortés's instruction. What happens next remains disputed across every source that survives. Cortés's second letter claims discovery of a Mexico-directed ambush, streets barricaded, rooftop stones stockpiled, sacrificial poles erected for the expected captives. Diaz del Castillo corroborates the warning, attributing it to Malintzин's intelligence from a local noblewoman. Nahua accounts recorded decades later by Sahagun's informants describe the event differently, as unprovoked aggression against a city that had merely closed its markets. What is documented beyond dispute is the outcome. Over several hours, Spanish soldiers and Tlaxcalan warriors fall upon Cholula's warrior nobility in the temple precinct and through the streets. Thousands perish. The number varies wildly. Cortés claims 6,000, other estimates run lower, but the political effect is immediate and calculable. Every tributary city between Cholula and the Valley of Mexico receives the message. Resistance carries a cost that Moctezuma's distant authority cannot prevent. The column resumes its march in early November, climbing toward the pass between the two volcanoes. Popocatépetl venting sulphurous smoke to the south, Iztaccíhuatl silent and snow-covered to the north. The pass sits at roughly 10,000 feet. Spanish soldiers from the Caribbean lowlands labor in thin air, breath-clouding, cotton-padded Tlaxcalan warriors moving more easily at altitudes their bodies know. Then the descent begins, and the Valley of Mexico opens below. Every Spanish account that survives pauses at this moment. Diaz del Castillo, writing decades later, recalls that the soldiers said it resembled the enchanted things told of in the Book of Amadis, a comparison to chivalric romance that reveals how far beyond European experience the site falls. The lake system stretches across the valley floor, interconnected sheets of water catching November light. Cities ring the shores, Texcoco to the east, Tacuba to the west, Iztapalapa to the south, and at the center, connected to the mainland by 3 causeways, each wide enough for 8 horsemen abreast, sits Tenochtitlan itself, its temple pyramids rising white against the water. The column descends to Iztapalapa on November 7th, hosted by the local lord in a lakeside palace with gardens that Cortés describes in careful detail to the Spanish crown. Fruit trees, stone-lined pools, canals connecting to the main lake. Everything is engineered, irrigated, deliberate. This is not wilderness. This is infrastructure on a scale that rivals anything in Europe. On the morning of November 8, 1519, the combined force moves onto the Great Southern Causeway. It runs roughly 5 miles across the lake surface, built of packed earth and stone, wide and solid, with wooden bridges at intervals that can be removed to sever passage. Thousands of canoes cluster on the water alongside, filled with onlookers. The procession moves slowly. Spanish soldiers in steel, Tlaxcalan warriors in quilted armor and feathered insignia, horses clattering on stone. At the causeway's end, where it meets the island city, Moctezuma waits. He arrives carried on a litter, wearing a turquoise diadem, his sandals soled in gold, attended by lords who sweep the ground before his feet. No commoner may look directly at the Tlatoani. The meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés is recorded in multiple sources with irreconcilable variations. What words passed, what gestures were exchanged, whether Moctezuma acknowledged the strangers as returning gods or merely as powerful ambassadors. The god myth, scholars now largely agree, was elaborated after the conquest to rationalize the Tlatoani's hesitation. What the sources do confirm is simpler and more devastating. Moctezuma allows the entire foreign force and its Tlaxcalan allies, his empire's bitterest enemies, to enter his capital. The Spanish are quartered in the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's father, near the ceremonial center. They find walls thick enough to fortify, rooms large enough to stable horses, and a position at the political heart of an empire of millions. Cortés has walked his 600 men and their allied thousands across the causeway and into the one place from which retreat will be nearly impossible. The bridges behind them can be pulled. The lake surrounds them. Every advantage of the island fortress that has protected Tenochtitlan for 2 centuries now works in reverse. It can trap the guests as easily as it once repelled invaders. The causeways that carried them in will become corridors of catastrophe before the year turns. Within days of settling into the palace of Axayacatl, Cortés makes the most audacious move of the entire campaign. He seizes Moctezuma. The pretext is an incident on the coast. A Mexican tax collector has clashed with the Totonac garrison at Veracruz, and several Spaniards are among the casualties. Cortés presents this to the Tlatoani as a betrayal requiring explanation, and on the 14th of November, 1519, he walks into Moctezuma's own palace with 30 armed men and informs the ruler that he must come to the Spanish quarters as a guest, or be taken by force. Moctezuma, surrounded by his own court, his own warriors, his own city of 200,000, agrees to go. The sources disagree on whether this was paralysis, calculation, or religious resignation, but the result is unambiguous. The most powerful man in Mesoamerica becomes a hostage in his father's house. For nearly 6 months, the arrangement holds in a state of controlled absurdity. Moctezuma continues to receive tribute delegations, issue orders, and perform ceremonies, but always under Spanish guard. Cortés governs through him, demanding gold, extracting intelligence about the empire's provinces, and quietly strengthening the palace fortifications. Crossbowmen stand at every gate. Horses are kept saddled. The Mexican nobility watches, and the tension coils tighter with each passing week. Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, and Cacama, lord of Texcoco, urge action. Moctezuma restrains them. The empire's political structure, built on the Tlatoani's absolute authority, becomes the very mechanism of its paralysis. No one can act without his command, and his command is now filtered through Spanish steel. Then, in April of 1520, a new crisis arrives from the sea. Governor Velázquez of Cuba, furious at Cortés's unauthorized conquest, dispatches Pánfilo de Narváez with 19 ships and perhaps 900 men to arrest him. Cortés faces destruction from behind. He splits his already tiny force, leaving roughly 140 Spaniards in Tenochtitlan under Pedro de Alvarado, and marches to the coast with the rest. It is a decision that will cost thousands of lives. On the 27th of May, Cortés attacks Narváez's camp at Chempoala in a night raid, captures the commander, and absorbs his entire army, doubling his Spanish strength in a single stroke. But the man he has left behind possesses none of his political instinct. Alvarado is a soldier, brave and blunt, and he is watching the Mexica prepare for the festival of Tlaxcalan, the great ceremony honoring Tezcatlipoca held in the sacred precinct beside the Templo Mayor. Hundreds of the highest-ranking warriors and nobles gather unarmed, adorned in feathers and gold, dancing in the temple courtyard. Alvarado, claiming intelligence of a planned uprising, or perhaps simply seeing an opportunity to decapitate the Mexica military leadership, orders his men to seal the courtyard gates. What follows is not a battle, but a slaughter. The sources, both Spanish and Nahua, agree on the essential fact. Unarmed celebrants are cut down in an enclosed space. Sahagun's Florentine Codex, compiled from Nahua informants decades later, describes the horror in terms that leave no ambiguity about the scale. The city erupts. Within hours, the Spanish garrison is besieged inside the palace of Axayacatl. Warriors mass on every rooftop. Stones and darts rain into the courtyard. The causeways are barricaded. The bridges are pulled. Everything Cortés feared about the island fortress becomes reality in a single afternoon. The water that once protected Tenochtitlan now seals the Spanish inside it. Alvarado's men huddle behind walls with a captive emperor whose authority is disintegrating by the hour. Moctezuma is no longer a useful hostage. He is becoming irrelevant. The political order that held the empire still has shattered, and in its place rises something Cortés never planned for, a city of 200,000 people unified not by obedience to their Tlatoani, but by rage. When Cortés returns from the coast in late June with his reinforced column, he marches back into a capital that is no longer a prize to be managed, but a trap already sprung. Cortés re-enters Tenochtitlan on June 24, 1520, with over 1,300 Spaniards, his original garrison reinforced by the soldiers he has just taken from Narvaez on the coast. The numbers should feel overwhelming. They are not. The city is silent in a way that veterans recognize as dangerous. Markets are closed. Canoes have vanished from the canals. The palace of Axayacatl, where the garrison has been barricaded for weeks, is surrounded by a population that no longer obeys its emperor and no longer fears the strangers. Moctezuma is brought to the rooftop. The sources disagree on what happens next, and honesty demands saying so. Cortés's own letters claim that Tlatoani is struck by stones thrown by his own people and dies of his injuries 3 days later. Nahua accounts recorded by Sahagun suggest the Spanish killed him once his usefulness ended. What is documented beyond dispute is the result. By late June, Moctezuma is gone, and with him vanishes the last political instrument Cortés possessed inside the city. The new war leader, Cuitlahuac, has no interest in negotiation. The bridges on the causeways are being systematically removed. Cortés understands the arithmetic. 1,300 Spaniards and perhaps 5,000 Tlaxcalan allies are trapped on an island with a hostile population that outnumbers them 100 to 1. Food is running short. Powder is limited. Every hour inside the city is an hour closer to annihilation. On the night of June 30th, he orders the retreat along the Tlacopan Causeway, the shortest of the 3 roads to the mainland, roughly 3 miles of narrow stone over black water. The column steps out into rain and darkness. A portable wooden bridge is carried at the front to span the first gap where the Mexica have pulled the stonework. The plan requires speed and silence. It gets neither. A woman drawing water spots the movement. Within minutes, conch-shell trumpets echo across the lake. Torches flare on the water as hundreds, then thousands of canoes launch from every quarter of the city. The first gap is bridged. The column pushes forward. At the second gap, the portable bridge jams under the weight of men and horses and cannot be extracted. From this moment, the retreat becomes a catastrophe measured in gaps. Each broken section of causeway becomes a killing ground where the column compresses, stops, and is struck from both sides by warriors in canoes and from behind by pursuers on the causeway itself. Men fall into the lake under the weight of steel armor. Horses scream and plunge into water. The treasure, gold bars, jewels, the accumulated plunder of months, is abandoned or drags its carriers into the dark water. The rearguard under Pedro de Alvarado fights a retreating action that later legend transforms into a single impossible leap across a causeway gap. The leap is almost certainly invention. Diaz del Castillo, who was there, says the gap was filled with wreckage and bodies that formed a terrible bridge. What is factual is that Alvarado reaches the mainland alive, one of the last to cross. By dawn on July 1st, the survivors stagger into the village of Popotla on the western shore. The losses are staggering. Over 800 Spaniards are gone, some sources say as many as 1,000. Several thousand Tlaxcalan allies have perished. Nearly all the cannon are lost. Most of the horses are gone. The powder is wet or abandoned. Cortés sits beneath a great cypress tree, and Diaz del Castillo records that the captain wept. Later historians would call the tree the Árbol de la Noche Triste, though the original cypress no longer stands. The Mexica do not pursue to destruction at dawn, a decision shaped by their own doctrine of capture and by the need to deal with prisoners already taken. This pause, born of a military culture that fights for different purposes than European annihilation warfare, gives the shattered column hours it should not have. Cortés still has perhaps 400 Spaniards, many wounded, a handful of horses, and the Tlaxcalan survivors who have not melted into the countryside. The road east toward Tlaxcala stretches across open highland, and between the column and safety stands every warrior the Valley of Mexico can muster. The retreat is not over. It has barely begun. The column staggers northeast through the first days of July, 1520, and the landscape offers no mercy. Perhaps 400 Spaniards remain on their feet, most carrying wounds, many without weapons. The Tlaxcalan allies who stayed number in the low thousands, exhausted, hungry, strung out along a road that crosses open plateau country with almost no cover. Cortés rides near the front with a broken left hand, 2 fingers splinted with strips of cotton. The horses that survived, fewer than 20, are gaunt and limping. Behind them, the Valley of Mexico empties its garrisons. On July 7th, near the plain of Otumba, the trap closes. A Mexican army fills the valley ahead. Estimates range from several thousand to the tens of thousands that Diaz del Castillo later claimed, though the precise number remains uncertain. What is certain is that the force is enormous relative to the broken column, and it is deployed across flat ground ideal for encirclement. The Spaniards cannot retreat. They cannot maneuver. They can only advance into the mass or die where they stand. What happens next turns on a single tactical reality. Mexica command structure is visible. The army fights under feathered standards carried by senior commanders wearing elaborate insignia, and the loss of those standards signals collapse. Cortés recognizes this. The surviving cavalry, perhaps 5 or 6 riders still capable of a charge, forms a wedge aimed not at the Mexica line broadly, but at the cluster of standards marking the commanding general, the Chihuahuacoatl, or a senior war chief. The charge punches through. A horseman, traditionally identified as Juan de Salamanca, strikes down the standard-bearer. The great feathered banner falls. The effect is immediate. Mexica formations waver, then fragment. The doctrine of coordinated capture requires command coherence, and with the standards down, units lose direction. The Spaniards and Tlaxcalans push through the disintegrating center and break into open country beyond. Otumba is not a great victory in the European sense. It is a desperate lunge that succeeds because it targets the single vulnerability of an army built on visible hierarchy. Within days, the column reaches Tlaxcalan territory. The reception is the hinge of the entire war. Tlaxcala's leaders could finish the Spaniards easily. Instead, they shelter them. The calculation is coldly political. The Mexica remain Tlaxcala's existential enemy, and a weakened Cortés still represents the best weapon against the Triple Alliance. The alliance holds. Through the autumn of 1520, Cortés rebuilds. Reinforcements trickle in from the coast, ships arriving at Veracruz carrying men who know nothing of the disaster, plus supplies and horses purchased from Cuba. By December, the Spanish force grows to perhaps 550 soldiers with 40 horses. More critically, the Tlaxcalan alliance deepens into full military partnership, with thousands of warriors drilling alongside Spanish infantry. But the most devastating weapon arrives invisibly. Smallpox, introduced by an infected member of the Narvaez expedition months earlier, sweeps through the Valley of Mexico beginning in October. The disease moves through populations with no immunity at catastrophic speed. Entire households die within weeks. The epidemic kills Cuitláhuac, the Tlatoani who organized the Noche Triste victory after a reign of only 80 days. Modern estimates suggest the epidemic kills roughly 40% of the valley's population, perhaps 1 million people in a few months. Cities that could have fielded thousands of warriors become ghost towns. The political architecture of the Triple Alliance cracks under the weight of death and doubt. Tributary states that paid tribute out of fear begin to calculate differently. Texcoco, the second city of the alliance, fractures into factions, one of which will soon welcome Cortés. Chalco, Xochimilco, and smaller lakeside polities send quiet messages eastward to Tlaxcala. The empire that seemed invincible in November of 1519 is hollowed from within by disease, succession crisis, and the defection of vassals who see which way the wind turns. In Tenochtitlan, a young prince named Cuauhtemoc rises to the position of Tlatoani, perhaps 25 years old, a warrior of proven courage, inheriting a city already filling with the sick and the grieving. He begins fortifying the causeways, stockpiling weapons, and rallying what remains of the imperial army. Meanwhile, in the mountain forests above Tlaxcala, a Spanish shipwright named Martin Lopez selects timber for 13 keels. The war for the lake is about to begin on terms neither side has fought on before. Martin Lopez is no ordinary soldier. He is a carpenter from Seville who crossed the Atlantic with tools and timber knowledge, and now, in the thin mountain air above Tlaxcala, he undertakes one of the most extraordinary engineering feats of the 16th century. The task is simple to state and staggering to execute. Build a fleet where no navigable water exists, then carry it across a mountain range to a lake 60 miles away. The work begins in December of 1520, in forests of oak and pine above the Tlaxcalan Plateau at an altitude of over 7,000 feet. Lopez selects trees for their straightness and grain, felling them with steel axes while Tlaxcalan laborers haul the trunks to an improvised shipyard. He has perhaps a dozen Spanish carpenters and smiths to assist him, but the bulk of the labor force is indigenous, hundreds of Tlaxcalan workers cutting, shaping, and hauling under his direction. Iron fittings, nails, and rigging are salvaged from the ships Cortés scuttled at Vera Cruz 18 months earlier, carried inland by porters. Pitch comes from pine resin tapped in the surrounding forests. Sailcloth is stitched from canvas stores. Every brigantine is designed to the same rough pattern, approximately 40 feet in length, flat-bottomed enough to navigate the shallow margins of Lake Texcoco, rigged with a single mast and square sail, fitted with oar ports for 12 rowers per side, and armed with a small cannon at the bow. Each vessel can carry roughly 25 men. The construction takes nearly 4 months. Lopez works through illness. Sources record him falling sick at least once during the project, and through the constant pressure of Cortés's demands for speed. The brigantines are not built as finished vessels. They are prefabricated in sections, keels, ribs, planking, masts, all shaped and fitted, then disassembled and bundled for transport. The genius of the plan lies not in the shipbuilding alone, but in the logistics of delivery. By late February of 1521, the sections are ready. Cortés organizes a massive column for the portage. 8,000 Tlaxcalan tamames, professional porters accustomed to carrying heavy loads across mountain terrain, shoulder the bundled hull sections, planking, masts, rigging, sails, ironwork, and cannon. 20,000 Tlaxcalan warriors march as escort. The column stretches for miles along the mountain road, descending from Tlaxcala toward the Valley of Mexico, winding through passes where ambush is possible and the loss of even one hull section could cripple the entire campaign. Cortés assigns Sandoval to command the escort, and the march takes several days, crossing terrain that rises and falls through pine forests and volcanic ridge lines before dropping into the valley floor. The destination is Texcoco, the great lakeside city on the eastern shore that has already defected from the Triple Alliance. Its ruler, Ixtlilxochitl, has thrown his support to Cortés, providing not only a base of operations, but laborers to dig a canal from the city to the lake edge, a channel nearly half a mile long and 12 feet wide, deep enough to float the assembled brigantines into open water. Thousands of Texcocan workers excavate this canal over several weeks, while Lopez and his team reassemble the hulls, caulk the seams with pitch and oakum, step the masts, and mount the guns. By late April of 1521, 13 brigantines sit in the finished canal, their hulls sealed, their rigging taut, their cannon loaded. No European has ever built a naval squadron in the interior of a continent and carried it over mountains to wage war on a lake. The fleet represents not merely firepower, but control. Whoever commands the surface of Lake Texcoco commands the causeways, the supply lines, the canoe traffic, and the fate of the island city. Cuauhtémoc understands this. His warriors have watched the construction from a distance, and Mexica war canoes, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, are being gathered and organized for the confrontation that is now weeks away. The lake that has protected Tenochtitlan for 2 centuries is about to become the arena where its survival is decided. The brigantines wait in their canal, and the water ahead of them leads straight to the heart of the empire. Before the brigantines can reach the lake, the land around it must be secured. Through April and into May of 1521, Cortés methodically reduces the lakeside towns that form the outer ring of Mexica control. Ixtapaluca, Chalco, Xochimilco, each is taken or turned, sometimes by force, more often by diplomacy backed by the visible mass of allied warriors now swelling daily. Texcoco, the old rival of Tenochtitlan, has already declared for the Spanish, and its lord Tenochtitlan provides warriors, canoes, and intelligence. The Allied host assembling around the lake numbers somewhere between 75,000 and 200,000. The sources disagree sharply, but even the lowest estimate dwarfs the Spanish contingent of perhaps 900 soldiers. These indigenous armies are not auxiliaries. They are the siege force. The Spanish provide steel, gunpowder, horses, and the brigantines. The Allies provide the overwhelming numbers without which no causeway can be held, and no blockade sustained. The first strategic blow falls on the Chapultepec aqueduct. This single conduit of clay and stone carries fresh water from the springs at Chapultepec Hill across the lake's western edge and into the island city. Tenochtitlan has cisterns and some wells, but for a population still numbering perhaps 100,000 even after smallpox, the aqueduct is survival itself. Cortés assigns Alvarado's column to sever it. The operation meets fierce resistance. Mexican warriors defend the pipeline with canoe-borne counterattacks, but by late May, the aqueduct is broken. The water stops flowing. Inside the city, Cuauhtémoc orders rationing, but the arithmetic is merciless. Every day without fresh water weakens the garrison more than any assault could. Cortés divides his Spanish forces into 3 columns, each assigned to one of the great causeways. Pedro de Alvarado takes the Tlacopan causeway on the west, the same road of the Noche Triste disaster, a choice heavy with memory. Cristobal de Olid advances along the Coyoacan causeway from the south. Gonzalo de Sandoval moves to Iztapalapa to control the southeastern approach. Each column numbers roughly 200 Spaniards supported by thousands of allied warriors. The 3 prongs are designed to pin the defenders on every front, while the brigantines sweep the open water between them. On the 28th of April, the 13 brigantines slide from their canal into Lake Texcoco. Each vessel stretches roughly 12 meters in length, carries a falconet cannon at the bow, and holds 25 men, oarsmen, crossbowmen, and a captain. They are shallow-drafted, maneuverable, and vastly superior to any canoe in speed and firepower. The Mexica answer immediately. Hundreds of war canoes surge out from the city's canal network, paddlers driving hard across the flat water. The first engagement is decisive. The brigantines' cannons scatter the canoe formations at distance, and their higher freeboard makes boarding nearly impossible. Within days, the lake surface belongs to Cortés. Canoe traffic between Tenochtitlan and the mainland, the lifeline of food, reinforcements, and communication, begins to strangle. By May 26, 1521, the siege is formally set. 3 causeway columns press inward. 13 brigantines patrol the lake in rotating squadrons. The aqueduct is dry. The Allied armies ring the shoreline, blocking every landing point. Cuauhtémoc, elected Tlatoani at roughly 25 years of age, surveys a situation that worsens by the hour, but refuses every overture of surrender. His strategy is clear: hold the causeways, use the canal grid inside the city as a defensive maze, and wait for the alliance against him to fracture. It is not an unreasonable calculation. Coalitions of convenience have broken before. But the water is gone, the lake is lost, and the causeways are filling with enemies who remember generations of tribute and sacrifice demanded by the island city. The noose draws tight, and the first columns begin their advance across the narrow stone roads towards the temples visible on the horizon. The pattern of the siege settles into a brutal rhythm within the first week of June, 1521. Each morning, the 3 Spanish columns advance along their assigned causeways: Alvarado from Tlacopan on the west, Olid from Coyoacan on the south, Sandoval from Iztapalapa on the southeast. Each column numbers between 150 and 200 Spaniards, supported by thousands of allied warriors, sometimes 10,000 or more per causeway. They push forward, filling gaps where the Mexica have broken the roadway overnight, laying beams and rubble into the chest-deep water so that horsemen and cannon can follow. By afternoon, they have gained a few hundred paces. By nightfall, they withdraw to their camps on the mainland, and in the darkness, Mexica engineers tear up everything that was rebuilt. This is the geometry that Cuauhtémoc exploits with extraordinary precision. The causeways are narrow, perhaps 8 to 10 paces wide, and every 50 or 60 paces a canal crossing has been demolished. The defenders mass behind each gap, loosing stones and darts from rooftops on either side of the road where the waterway meets the city's edge. Canoe flotillas strike the flanks of the advancing columns from the open lake, forcing the brigantines to peel away from their patrol stations to intercept. It is a war of engineering against engineering, patience against patience, and for weeks neither side breaks the deadlock. Cortés recognizes the futility of advancing by day and retreating by night. He orders his captains to hold ground, to demolish every building along the causeway margins as they advance, filling the canals with rubble so thoroughly that the defenders cannot reopen them. Allied warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, Huexotzinco, and Chalco perform the staggering labor, pulling down adobe walls and dragging stone into the water under constant harassment. The advance slows to a crawl measured in buildings destroyed per day rather than distance gained. Then comes the disaster. On the 30th of June, Cortés personally leads a thrust deep along the Iztapalapa causeway, driving toward the great marketplace of Tlatelolco. The advance outruns its support. A canal gap behind the column has not been properly filled, and Mexica warriors, concealed in side channels, suddenly counterattack from 3 directions. The retreat jams at the unfilled breach. Canoes swarm from both sides. In the chaos, 53 Spaniards are cut off and seized alive, along with several horses and at least 1 small cannon. Cortés himself nearly falls. Diaz del Castillo records that 2 Tlaxcalan warriors and a Spanish soldier named Cristobal de Olea drag him free, Olea suffering wounds that will later prove fatal. The captured Spaniards are taken to the summit of the great temple. That evening, from their camps on the causeways, the besieging forces can see fires burning atop the pyramid and hear the sound of drums, the great huhuitl whose deep pulse carries across the water. The Mexica display captured Spanish weapons and armor on the temple platform, visible for miles. The psychological effect is immediate. Several Allied contingents waver. Ambassadors from Cuauhtémoc reach the Allied camps, warning that the strangers will all be destroyed within 8 days, a prophecy their priests have pronounced. Some Allied towns briefly pull back their warriors. This is the moment the siege nearly unravels. Cortés responds not with another frontal assault, but with patience. He halts causeway advances for 4 days, redeploys the brigantines in tighter formations to intercept canoe supply runs, and sends messengers to every Allied town with gifts and reassurances. The coalition holds, though barely. The Texcocan contingent under Ixtlilxochitl remains firm, and the Tlaxcalans, whose hatred of the Mexica runs deeper than any single defeat, refuse to withdraw. Inside the city, the victory buys time, but not water. The Chapultepec aqueduct remains severed. The lake itself, brackish and undrinkable in the central basin, offers nothing. Cuauhtémoc's warriors dig wells that yield only salt. Food runs short as the brigantines intercept canoe convoys attempting to reach the city from the eastern shore. The population, already ravaged by smallpox months earlier, begins to starve. Yet the defenders fight on with a ferocity that astonishes every Spanish chronicler. Each canal becomes a fortress. Each rooftop becomes a rampart. The city consumes itself in its own defense, and the columns resume their grinding advance through the first days of July, filling canals with the rubble of the civilization they are dismantling. Cuauhtémoc is perhaps 25 years old. He was elected Tlatoani in the desperate winter of 1520 to 1521, after smallpox claimed his predecessor Cuitláhuac barely 80 days into that reign. He is a son of Ahuitzotl, nephew of Moctezuma, trained as an eagle warrior, and he has never known a world without war. By the time the siege enters its 6th week in early July of 1521, he commands a city that is slowly being eaten from its edges inward, and he has refused every offer of terms Cortés has sent across the water. The refusals are not reckless. Cuauhtémoc understands what surrender means. The Tlaxcalans fighting alongside the Spanish have made their intentions plain through months of systematic demolition. Every palace taken is leveled. Every canal crossed is filled with the debris of temples and homes so that no bridge gap can be reopened behind the advancing columns. The allied warriors, numbering tens of thousands, perhaps far more, are not fighting for Cortés. They are fighting to destroy the Mexica tributary order that taxed their grain, conscripted their labor, and took their children for sacrifice. Surrender does not mean negotiation, it means annihilation. So Cuauhtémoc fights. His strategy through July is to exploit the one weakness the Spanish have demonstrated repeatedly, their dependence on the narrow causeways. On the 30th of June, the defenders spring their most devastating trap. Cortés himself leads an advance along the Iztapalapa causeway, pushing deep into the city's southern districts. His men move too fast. Engineers fail to fill the canal gaps behind the column. Cuauhtémoc's warriors, concealed in buildings and canoes positioned in side canals, attack simultaneously from 3 directions. The retreat becomes a catastrophe in the confined space. 53 Spaniards are taken alive. Thousands of allied warriors fall or are captured alongside them. What follows is calculated to shatter morale. The captured Spaniards are brought to the summit of the great temple in Tlatelolco, visible across the water to every besieging camp. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, stationed with Alvarado's column on the Tacuba causeway, later writes that he could see the captives being forced up the temple steps. The sacrificial drums sound across the lake. The bodies are displayed. Captured Spanish weapons, horses' heads, and severed limbs are sent to wavering allied towns with a single message: the strangers can be killed. Their gods do not protect them. Return to the old order. The effect is immediate and nearly fatal to the siege. Several allied contingents withdraw entirely. Towns that had pledged support to Cortés send no further warriors. For perhaps 10 days, the Spanish columns halt their advances and hold defensive positions on the causeways, unable to push forward without indigenous numbers to fill the gaps and hold cleared ground. Cortés, according to his own 3rd letter to Charles V, considers whether the siege can continue at all. Yet Cuauhtémoc cannot exploit the pause. His city is dying. The aqueduct has been severed for weeks. Wells yield only brackish water. The brigantines patrol the lake in rotating shifts, intercepting canoe convoys that attempt to bring maize and fresh water from the eastern and southern shores under cover of darkness. The population, swollen with refugees from destroyed lakeside towns, subsists on roots, insects, leather, and lake weeds. Disease compounds starvation, not only the lingering effects of smallpox, but dysentery from contaminated water. The Florentine Codex, compiled decades later from Nahua informants who survived the siege, describes defenders too weak to stand who continued to hurl stones from seated positions on rooftops. By mid-July, Cuauhtémoc consolidates his remaining forces into the northern district of Tlatelolco, whose marketplace, the largest in the Americas, capable of holding 60,000 people on market days, becomes the final defensive perimeter. The canals here are narrower, the buildings denser, the approaches more easily blocked. Every structure becomes a fighting position. Women and old men carry rubble to rebuild barricades overnight that the Spanish and their allies tear down each day. The defenders strip feathers and cotton from ceremonial garments to fashion new shields. They recover Spanish crossbow bolts from the rubble and hurl them back by hand. Cortés sends 3 more peace offers through captured messengers. Each time, Cuauhtémoc's war council deliberates. Each time, the answer returns the same. The young Tlatoani will not surrender a city that is already more ruin than city, more graveyard than capital. The perimeter contracts another block. The columns resume their advance through the rubble, filling canals with the stones of Tlatelolco's own walls. By the first days of August 1521, the living space remaining to the defenders of Tenochtitlan has shrunk to a few blocks in the northeastern corner of Tlatelolco. What was once an island metropolis stretching across 5 square miles is now a landscape of rubble, collapsed temples, and canals choked with the debris of 70 days of systematic demolition. The great marketplace of Tlatelolco, which once held 60,000 traders on a busy day, lies within the last perimeter. The stench of death and starvation hangs over everything. Cortés's indigenous allies, numbering in the tens of thousands, continue tearing down every standing wall, filling every canal, denying the defenders any structure from which to fight. On August 12th, Cortés orders a final coordinated assault from all 3 causeway columns. Alvarado presses from the west, Sandoval from the north, and Cortés himself advances from the south, with the bulk of the brigantine fleet covering the waterfront. The allied Tlaxcalan, Texcocan, and Chalcan warriors pour into the rubble alongside the Spanish, vastly outnumbering the remaining Mexica fighters. The defenders, weakened beyond recognition by weeks without fresh water and months of epidemic disease, still resist from improvised barricades. But the lines cannot hold. Position after position collapses under sheer weight of numbers. By the morning of August 13th, the fighting reaches the waterfront at the northeastern edge of Tlatelolco. Cuauhtémoc, who has refused every offer of surrender, now faces a decision with no good outcome. The city behind him is gone. His warriors number perhaps a few thousand, many too weak to lift weapons. The causeways are held by the enemy. Only the lake remains open, and even there the 13 brigantines patrol in a tightening arc. Cuauhtémoc boards a large war canoe with his family and a small retinue of nobles, pushing out onto the lake in an attempt to reach the eastern shore. Dozens of other canoes flee simultaneously, carrying warriors, women, and children away from the collapsing perimeter. The brigantines spot the exodus almost immediately. Garcia Holguin, captaining the brigantine named after the Virgin, gives chase. His vessel, carrying a small cannon and oars, pulling hard, overtakes the royal canoe within minutes. The disparity is absolute, a 40-foot armed vessel against a wooden canoe. Cuauhtémoc, recognizing the end, signals his paddlers to stop. He steps aboard the brigantine and identifies himself. He is perhaps 25 or 26 years old. He has held the defense for 75 days. Holguin brings the captive Tlatoani to Cortés, who waits on a rooftop in the ruined southern quarter. Gonzalo de Sandoval disputes the credit for the capture, claiming his own brigantine forced the canoe toward Holguin. The argument between the two captains will persist for years in legal testimony. What is not disputed is the moment itself. When Cuauhtémoc stands before Cortés, the fighting across the city stops. Word passes through the rubble in minutes. Warriors lay down macuahuitl and shields. The silence, after months of constant combat, is sudden and total. What remains of Tenochtitlan on the evening of August 13th, 1521, is scarcely recognizable as a city. The temples are broken. The causeways are gaps of rubble and improvised fill. The canals are clogged. The aqueducts have been dry for weeks. Conservative modern estimates suggest that over 100,000 defenders perished during the siege from the combined effects of combat, starvation, disease, and thirst. The Florentine Codex, compiled decades later from Nahua testimony, describes the survivors emerging from the ruins so thin they seemed like shadows. Cortés himself, in his third letter to Charles V, acknowledges the scale of destruction with a tone closer to unease than triumph. The Allied indigenous forces begin moving through the fallen city. Looting is immediate and vast. The Spanish search for the gold lost on the Noche Triste and find almost nothing. The lake has swallowed it, or the defenders have hidden it beyond recovery. The treasure that launched the expedition, that burned in every Spanish imagination for 2 years, has largely vanished. As dusk settles over the Valley of Mexico, smoke still rises from the ruins. The lake reflects a city that no longer exists in any form its builders would recognize. Somewhere in the wreckage, the foundations of a colonial capital are already being imagined, stone by stone, laid directly over what came before. Within weeks of the fall, Cortés orders the ruined city rebuilt, not beside the old capital, but directly on top of it. Indigenous laborers, many of them the same allied warriors who helped destroy Tenochtitlan, now clear rubble and lay foundations for a colonial grid. The great temple precinct becomes the site of a cathedral. The palace of Axayacatl, where the Spanish had been quartered and besieged, gives way to the viceroy's residence. Canal by canal, the lake itself begins to disappear, drained and filled over decades, then centuries, until the water that once made the city unconquerable exists only as seasonal flooding and underground aquifers beneath modern pavement. Cuauhtémoc survives the fall, but not the peace. Cortés keeps him alive for nearly 4 years, partly as a political instrument to manage the defeated population, partly to extract information about hidden treasure that may never have existed. In 1525, during a grueling expedition to Honduras, Cortés has Cuauhtémoc executed, hanged, according to most accounts, on suspicion of plotting rebellion. Diaz del Castillo, who witnessed it, writes that many Spaniards considered the act unjust. the last Tlatoani was perhaps 29 years old. The demographic catastrophe dwarfs the siege itself. Smallpox had already swept the valley before the final assault. In the decades that follow, waves of measles, typhus, and other diseases reduce the indigenous population of central Mexico from an estimated 25 million to roughly 1 million by 1600. Entire communities vanish. The tributary system that once fed the Triple Alliance now feeds the encomienda, and the labor that built pyramids builds churches. Yet Nahua culture does not disappear. The Nahuatl language survives, spoken today by nearly 2 million people. In the 1550s and 1560s, Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún collaborates with Nahua elders and scholars to produce the Florentine Codex, 12 volumes recording Mexica history, religion, natural knowledge, and a detailed indigenous account of the conquest itself, told from the perspective of the defeated. It remains one of the most extraordinary ethnographic documents ever created, and it preserves voices that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The sources that tell this story deserve honest scrutiny. Cortés's letters to Charles V are calculated political documents written to justify unauthorized actions and secure royal favor. Díaz del Castillo's chronicle, composed decades later, is vivid and often reliable, but shaped by an old soldier's grievances and self-promotion. López de Gómara never crossed the Atlantic. The indigenous accounts in the Florentine Codex and the Annals of Tlatelolco carry their own framing, composed under colonial supervision, filtered through the politics of survival. No single source tells the whole truth. The story of the conquest lives in the tension between them, and honest history means holding that tension without resolving it into comfortable certainty. In 1978, electrical workers digging near the Cathedral of Mexico City strike a massive carved stone, the great disk of Coyolxauhqui, the dismembered moon goddess, exactly where it had lain at the foot of the Temple Mare for 5 centuries. The discovery launches excavations that continue to this day, peeling back colonial layers to reveal the sacred precinct that Cortés's men described with astonishment in 1519. The foundations of the twin temples emerge, along with thousands of offerings, jade, shell, obsidian, the bones of sacrificed animals, a civilization's theology preserved in stone and earth directly beneath the living capital of modern Mexico. The lake is gone. The causeways are buried under highways. The aqueduct from Chapultepec is a memory traced by street names. But the grid of Tenochtitlan still shapes Mexico City's oldest neighborhoods, and the eagle on the cactus, the founding vision of the Mexica, remains at the center of the national flag. What 600 men and their tens of thousands of indigenous allies destroyed in 75 days was not erased. It was buried, built upon, remembered, contested, and rediscovered, and it endures beneath every footstep on the streets above the vanished lake. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most extraordinary collisions. If these stories brought the past to life for you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next chapter we uncover together.